Father, we give you thanks for the gospel. Thank you for Matthew, an eyewitness to these things and a participant in these events. Lord, help us to feel what he feels. Help us to understand what he has learned. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated. This week I have gone from agony to ecstasy. And if I keep at it, in a month or so, I'll have finished reading the dictionary. Okay, I've gone from agony to ecstasy, but the disciples have gone from ecstasy to agony in our text and in these few chapters that we're looking at together. In Matthew chapters 14 through 16, the disciples are in the school of discipleship. And it is the Jesus school of discipleship, and he doesn't do it the way that we think he should do it. He doesn't do it the way we would like him to do it. This is how Jesus makes disciples. So first, he spends time with his disciples, not with the crowds. He's teaching them personally, but he isn't just giving them knowledge. He is putting them through various experiences in which they learn faith and trust, and they learn obedience in the midst of all of the experiences that he gives to them. He's teaching them the way that he was taught. Hebrews chapter 5 verse 8 says that Jesus, even though he was a son, learned obedience through the things that he suffered. Well, there's something that we don't want to hear about. There's something that we don't want to deal with. There's something that this is how we learn. This is how we grow. We learn it through suffering, through trials, through temptations, through difficulties. This is the way the disciples learned the faith. And Peter, in his first epistle, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, says to his churches, "Why are you surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, as if something strange were happening?" There's nothing in here about your best life now. There's nothing in here about mountaintop experiences and one blessing after another blessing. This is Jesus discipling the disciples. And this is the disciples, typically, not picking up what he's putting down. They don't get it. I mean, he's not just telling them and explaining it to them. And wouldn't we all prefer to learn these lessons in a class? The Methodists have it down. They have a 2-part class called Disciple. And wouldn't it be nice if we just took the class and got a certificate, and then we were disciples, and we wouldn't have to go to the school of hard knocks? So in these chapters, these are the school of hard knocks. These are the lessons that Jesus is teaching the disciples. And here's the good news. There's occasionally, not all the time, but a little flicker, a little glimmer of faith. He's trying to teach them faith and obedience. And every once in a while, it looks like somebody might get it just for a minute or two, and then it falls away again. But that's what's going on in these chapters. And Jesus is discipling his disciples. When I grew up in the suburbs of D.C., and there were a lot of military, a lot of transients in our community, and up the hill was a family named the Mackeys, and we went to elementary school together until about 4th or 5th grade. Pat was a year older than me, Jimmy was a year younger than me, and their dad was in the military, and they got transferred to Turkey. So the whole family went to Turkey. And then in junior high, they moved back, and they were different. And they had all kinds of experiences and things that we didn't have living in the Bowie suburbs of D.C. And so they would tell us these stories, one of which was they used to go, when they were there in Turkey, to the bazaars. And you've seen them on Indiana Jones and that kind of stuff. You know, it's not a department store, it's a bunch of stalls, and you go and you haggle with the proprietor to buy a scarf or cloth or whatever it is. And in a lot of these bazaars, they had a silversmith. And the rich American tourists, you didn't know you were rich, but you are, they would give them coins. And did you know this? And until 1965, your dimes and your quarters and your 50-cent pieces were made of silver. And they were 90% pure silver. The government stopped doing that because they were worth more if you melt them down as an ounce of silver than they were as a coin that says a dime or 25 cents. But the rich American tourists would give the silversmith a coin, and he had a furnace, and on top of the furnace was a pot with molten silver in it, and he would take your coin and drop it in, and your coin would melt in with the rest of it, and then he would watch. And he would periodically go and look, and he'd take a stick and scrape it across the top and shake it off. And that was the dross rising from the process of the boiling and the heating of the silver. And the dross rises to the top, and it's scraped away. And one of the tourists asks, "Why do you keep looking in the pot?" And he says, "I'm waiting for it to be pure." "Well, how will you know when it's pure?" "When I look in and I see my reflection, and it looks just like I'm looking in a very fancy, expensive mirror. Then I know that the silver is pure." And then he could pour it off into a mold, or he could begin to work with the silver to create jewelry, which he would then turn around and sell to the rich American tourists. But this is the picture of discipleship. This is how God works. He heats us up. He brings us to a boil. It is uncomfortable, and we don't like it. And we begin to bubble, and we begin to boil, and he is taking a stick and scraping it across us, and he's taking off the dross, and we don't want this process the way that it's being done. This is what it means to be a disciple. In Malachi chapter 3, there's a beautiful picture. God sits as a refiner, a purifier of silver. And this is God's method for making disciples. This is how God discipled Jesus. This is how Jesus disciples his disciples. And on the whole, said W.C. Fields, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. Nobody wants to sign up for this. This is not a fun deal, but this is what Jesus is doing with his disciples. And so now we're coming to a change of last week. If you were here, Jesus fed the 5,000. And so he demonstrated that he was sufficient. The disciples understood that they had no sufficiency in themselves at all. They bring nothing to the table. And then there's something else that's going on. In John's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 15, it says that the crowd understood. Last week, Jesus is the prophet like Moses. They understood what that meant, that he's the Messiah. And so they got all ginned up. We're going to drag him to Jerusalem, and we're going to coronate him king, and he's going to stomp on the Romans. Because messianic expectation is, well, we know the Messiah is going to be a Jew, and he's going to whip up on God's enemies, and he's going to restore the glory of Israel. And that's their dream. That's what they wanted, and that's what the crowd wanted. Well, Jesus doesn't want his disciples being infected by that nationalistic virus. That's not who the Messiah is. Mark says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus is the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 and 53 and 54. He is not the conquering king and the hero that they all wanted. The French philosopher Voltaire said that God has created man in his image, and we have returned the favor. We have all kinds of false views, false understandings, false beliefs about God, mostly because we want him to be like us and value what we value, and because of what we want and what we need and what we desire. And so this is the kind of God that we create and worship. That was the messianic expectation in Israel. It wasn't the Messiah of the Scriptures. It was a Messiah of their own making who would wipe out their enemies and return them to world status as the preeminent superpower. That's what they wanted. Everybody knew that's what the Messiah would do. And Jesus, no, we're not doing that. And so Jesus then does something. And I love how our passage begins. If you've got your Bibles, Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. I think he borrows this from Mark, because Mark says it at the beginning of every chapter. Immediately. So immediately what? Immediately following the feeding of the 5,000, immediately Jesus compelled. He made his disciples get into the boat. He wanted to get them away from the crowd. He didn't want them listening to this false teaching about the Messiah, so I'm going to get rid of them, And then Jesus has 3 things he wants to do. So he dismisses the crowd. He's fed them. Their needs are met. And he's told them to go home. And now finally, and we talked about this at the beginning last week, he's there for 3 reasons. 1, he wants to mourn his cousin John. And he's had no space and no place and no time to mourn his cousin John. So he goes up on the mountain by himself in order to pray, in order to weep, in order to remember his cousin. He goes up there, according to Mark chapter 6, verses 31 and 32, he goes up there to rest. He is physically overwrought, mentally and spiritually overwrought. He's been giving and giving and giving, and he needs to fill himself back up again. And he can't do that in the presence of crowds and in the presence of his disciples. So he sends them away so that he can have a little bit of space, margin, peace, and quiet, so that he can reflect on John, so that he can clear his head of all the burdens that he has been carrying. And so he's up on this mountaintop, and he's looking down at the disciples as he's up there praying and grieving and resting and taking a break. And so the disciples, he's told, go home. They're to get on in the boat and go back to Capernaum. That's headquarters. It's Peter's house. It's where Jesus was living. This was the place where they left to go and do ministry, and then they would come back to as home base. And if they had a wind that was favorable, it wouldn't take very long to get back to the other side of the lake. If they didn't, it might be a couple hours of rowing, but they would be able to get home. But they weren't able to do that. So Matthew continues. He made the disciples, he compelled them to get in the boat and to go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountaintop to pray, and when evening came, he was there alone. But when the boat by this time was a long way away from the land, and it was beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them, he compelled them to get in the boat. He sent them into the teeth of the storm. He did it on purpose. That doesn't sound very loving. That's not very nice. Why, Jesus isn't like that. Yeah, he is. This is how the disciples learn. They learn in the school of hard knocks. They learn in the trials and difficulties. And this is wonderful. And Jesus doesn't quit on them. They might quit on him, but he doesn't quit on them. If you go back a couple chapters to chapter 8, you'll remember the story. Jesus has preached the Sermon on the Mount. He's healed a multitude of different people. Once again, he's wiped out. He's tired. He's asleep on a cushion in the back of the boat, and the disciples are rowing home. And then a storm comes up, and the water is coming into the boat, and they're about to be swamped. And these are fishermen. They live on the water, and they're freaking out. We're going down. And so they go back and they wake him up and they say, Master, don't you care that we are perishing? And so Jesus wakes up and he calms the storm and he says, oh, come on, guys, you have little faith. What, you think I brought you out here to drown you? For Pete's sake. But they didn't get it. And so guess what happens? A couple chapters later, here we are. They're out on the Sea of Galilee again, and they didn't learn the lesson the first time. So if you don't learn it the first time, the easy way, guess what's going to happen? Around and around, because God's at work in you. He's purifying you. He's bringing that pot to a boil, and he's going to continue to teach you, and he's going to continue to work with you, and he's going to continue to conform you to the image of his Son. And it doesn't happen a once and done for most of us. Some people are smart and they can do it that way. I'm not one of them. I suspect that many of you aren't that way either. And so we learn the hard way. You know, they ought to have figured this out yet. Now, what did they just do? Fed 5,000. Anybody remember what they did at the end of the feeding of the 5,000? They collected 12 baskets. Now, do you think they went to a dumpster and poured out, after having gone to all the trouble to gather it up, dump out? Where are the baskets? In the boat. They've got a sacramental load in the boat with them. What's a sacrament? An outward and visible sign of an inward and invisible grace. Here's 12 baskets, an outward and visible sign of Christ's care, of Christ's power, of Christ's ability at their feet. And they don't pay any attention to it at all. It's amazing to me. So there they are, surrounded by the evidence of Christ's power and care. Now you remember what happened. Jesus is looking for a quiet place, and he comes upon this crowd. And rather than getting angry or going someplace else, splagkanichomai is the Greek word, and it's in the gut, in the intestines. He feels compassion for the crowd. And he didn't even know those people. He fed up to 20,000 people. He didn't even know them. But he knows Peter, and he knows Andrew, and he knows John and James and Judas, and he knows these guys. He cares about these guys. But they're in the midst of a storm. And what do you do in the midst of your storms in your lives? Oh, God has forsaken me. God doesn't care about me. No, he sent them into the teeth of the storm so that they would learn to trust him. But they're concluding, but he's not there. Now, the last time there was a storm, he was with them in the boat. So if he was here, everything would be okay. But he's not here. Oh, we're lost. Oh gosh, we're going down. It's terrible. It's terrible. And we do that, and we conclude that God isn't with us, or we conclude that God doesn't care. I wouldn't be suffering. I wouldn't be frustrated. I wouldn't be having all these setbacks and difficulties in my life if Jesus was for me. I would be getting blessed and having my best life now. That's utter garbage. And if you've ever bought that book, put it in the trash. It's heresy. This is Jesus' school of discipleship right here. And it's the school of difficulties and trials. And they're concluding that he doesn't care about them. But Mark tells us, no, he's up on the mountain and he can see them straining at the oars. And they're there in the fourth watch of the night. So he's fed the 5,000. It's dusk. It's getting dark. Jesus sends the disciples home. Typically, a couple hours, they'll be in their own beds. But that's not what's happening. And so he sends them home. But he's up on the mountain. He can see them. He can see what they're going through. Jesus sees you whether he's with you or not. I have a Lutheran credential, and the Lutherans have a doctrine called ubiquity, that Jesus is everywhere, always, all the time. He's present. Jesus is always present. Because you can't take an infinite Jesus and pour him into a human body, Jesus of Nazareth, and that it would the body would take all of Jesus. There's lots of Jesus left over. And so Jesus spills out all over the world. He spills out onto the table. They have a doctrine of consubstantiation. The bread and the wine don't turn into anything, but Jesus is in, with, and under the bread and wine at the table. He's present with them. Now they're not Lutherans. They don't understand this. And so here they are in the boat, and they're bereft, and they think Jesus doesn't care about them, but Jesus sees them he doesn't even need supernatural abilities. He sees them straining at the oars. So Jesus is going to do something. And he's going to exercise, that's the human Jesus, now he's going to exercise the divine Jesus. You know, skeptics of the faith tell us and teach that nowhere in the Bible does Jesus claim to be God. Well, this passage gives the lie to that teaching. It's not true. So how does Jesus claim to be God? He comes to them walking on the water. And if you want to turn there, but you don't have to because I'm going to read it to you. Job chapter 9. Who walks on the water? Yahweh, the Creator, the God of Israel. And so, walking on the water, he is saying, I'm Yahweh. I am the God of Israel. And to make sure that we don't miss it, this is Matthew, the most Jewish of the gospel writers. He wants us to understand, we need to go to Job chapter 9. This is verse 8. It says, who alone stretched out the heavens, the Creator, Yahweh, and trampled the waves of the sea under his feet. Who does that? Yahweh, the God of Israel. The personal God that they know by name. So by walking out to them, he is proclaiming himself. Who is it? And then if you go down to verse 11, now Mark says this, Matthew doesn't. Mark says, and he walked up to the boat as if to pass them by. Here's verse 11 of Job chapter 9. Behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. Same Greek verb, same Greek tense in the Septuagint, so that they don't miss it. And so he arrives, and they're freaking out because they see a ghost. I'll get to that in a minute. But they're freaking out, and English is lame. It's useless. And so what does he say? "'Tis I." That's not what he says. You remember Moses talking to the burning bush, "And go and set my people free, and who shall I say is sending me?" And in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew, it is ego eimi, I am. And what does Jesus say as he approaches the boat? Ego eimi, I am. He's saying that he is Yahweh. He's saying that he is God. How much more clearly can he say it to his disciples than their Old Testament, and that he is Yahweh who tramples the waves under his feet? But that's not what they're picking up. They don't listen. They don't get it. What do they get? Oh, he's a ghost. Oh! Now, we have ghost stories. The best one ever is The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, Don Knotts, 1965. The best ghost story ever, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken. You've got to look it up. Now, that's what we think, and we have ghost stories, and we tell them around the campfire, and they're cute and fun, but that's not how Jews understood ghosts. For them, they're an evil omen, a bad portent. You might remember the story of the witch of Endor. Saul has been rejected by Samuel, God's prophet. "You are no longer going to be the king of God's people. I have rejected you." And Saul and Jonathan are girding up to go to war with the Philistines. And Saul has always relied on Samuel to tell him, give him advice, to talk to him, encourage him. And he's gone. Samuel's dead. But I'm going to call him up. He found a witch. Now, his job as the king was to get rid of them all. But there was one left, and she was in Endor. So he goes to Endor and disguises himself and has her call up Samuel. And Samuel shows up. And Samuel says, "Oh, Saul, you dim bulb, you're not supposed to do this. And guess what? Both you and your son are going to die in battle." The end, period. And then Israel moves on to David. But for Israelites, for Jews, a ghost is an evil omen, a portent. If a ghost shows up, you're a dead man walking. In other words, they see Jesus, a ghost, and it means that we're going to die. We're going to drown out here. That's what that means. That's why they're terrified. That's why they're freaking out. Not because he's an apparition and he's green and glows in the dark. And it's none of that. It's a proclamation that they're likely not to get out of this alive. And then Jesus, ego eimi, but I am God. Now they've already done this with him once. He calmed the storm. And now here's the little glimmer. Peter, finally, if it's you, not a ghost, if it's you, call me out so I can walk on the water too. In faith, there's a little glimmer of faith. There's a little flicker of faith in Peter. And so Peter steps out of the boat and heads towards Jesus. And he's rocking. That's awesome. Except that he sees the wind and the waves, and he loses his focus, and he begins to sink. "Oh, Lord, help me." And Jesus reaches out his hand and gets him and puts him back in the boat. And I love John's gospel. I think it's verse 15 of chapter 6 of John's gospel. And they joyfully allowed Jesus to get in the boat because they know now he's not a ghost. This is Jesus. It's okay. He can get in the boat with us, and maybe he'll still the storm like he did last time. And I love John's gospel again because then it says, and immediately he took them home. They're in Capernaum. So I don't know, he had a 200 horsepower Evinrude in his pocket, and he strapped it on the back of the boat and zipped them back to Capernaum in no time at all. But immediately, again, demonstrating his power, his sufficiency, his ability. And so the lessons that he's trying to teach the disciples are about faith and obedience. First, he sees you no matter where you are, no matter what's going on in your life. He probably arranged it. He probably compelled you to get into that boat because he's got lessons to teach you. This is what discipleship looks like. Secondly, he cares. He cared about an anonymous crowd, a bunch of people he didn't know. How much more does he care for you? You're a child of God. You're a disciple of Jesus, and he knows you by name, and you are his beloved, and he cares for you. And After you've learned, he will take you home. Now, home may not be home where you want to go. I'm not going back to Bowie, Maryland and going to 2511 Kitmore Lane. I'm pretty sure that's not in the plan. But he will take you to that place where you are called to serve, where you are called to do ministry, where you are called to be his disciple. And while he's doing all of that, remember the pot of bubbling silver. He's scraping off the dross so that wherever it is that he takes you and wherever he places you, you are a reflection of him. And he cares about you. William Barclay, in his commentary about this story about the storm and Jesus walking on water, right here at that place in his commentary says this: there was a one-room schoolhouse in rural England, and there's a young school marm there whose responsibility was to teach the kids, but also to ensure that they got home. Not a big class of kids, but a bunch of little kids. And everything was fine, and they did morning devotions. And one morning she did the devotion on Jesus walking on water and taught it to the kids, and apparently it got through to them. They understood it. But a big snowstorm came in, and just a blizzard, just dumping snow everywhere, and the wind was blowing, and the drifts were over the kids' heads. And she's dragging the kids over these snow drifts. And one of the little boys was overheard to say, now he's British. I wish I could do a British accent. He goes, "We could really do with that chap Jesus right about now." All of us could really do with that chap Jesus right about now. But we are, like the disciples, scattered. We aren't focused. We aren't listening. Jesus is trying to help us to learn about faith and obedience, but we have other agendas and other plans, and they don't include suffering, and they don't include trials and difficulties. Harry Ironside, in his commentary, he put it this way. There was a rich man who owned an ice house. Now, this is a long time ago. This is before refrigeration, before you had a freezer in your kitchen. And so you go to the ice house and get a big block of ice and come home and put it in your ice box. And in the ice house, it's sitting on sawdust, and so there's a layer of sawdust in there. And the owner goes in, he bends over to get something, and his pocket watch slips out into the sawdust and disappears. And he's reaching around and he can't find it. And so he offers a reward, and his workers go in there with rakes trying to find this watch, and they come out after an hour and they can't find this watch anywhere. And the workday is over, they leave, and a little boy goes in and he lies down in the sawdust. And a few minutes later he comes out holding the pocket watch. And the owner's like, "How did you do that?" He said, "Well, I went in and I laid down in the sawdust and I was very quiet and I could hear it ticking." All those old people that went to rock and roll concerts when they were in their misspent youth couldn't hear the ticking, but the little boy could. And so he comes out holding the pocket watch because he was able to hear and listen. Jesus speaks to us, but he does it quietly. He does it in stillness. He does it when we are settled and centered, when we're willing to hear what he has to say, but most of the time we're too busy. Most of the time we have other agendas. Most of the time we want to do other things. Jesus is busy about this process of discipleship, and it's done through experiences. It's not done in the classroom. It's not done in Bible study. That's what the church does, and I don't know why we do it that way, because if you read the scriptures, Jesus does it through experiences. He sends them out 2 by 2 to go have experiences. "Well, I haven't been to seminary. What if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to?" And we have all kinds of excuses of why we can't do things. Jesus didn't listen to any of that mess. Okay, next week you all are going to go out 2 by 2, and you're going to cast out demons, and you're going to heal people, and you're going to do miracles, and you're going to do, and they're like you. They're like, "What? You're nuts." And then they go out and do it. You remember last week, one of the things he's supposed to be doing with his disciples in this desolate place is an after-action report from the mission trip that he sent them on. He's still not had a chance to process all that stuff with the disciples that they learned in the experience they had in doing what he told them to do. Jesus wants us to learn. He wants us to grow. He wants us to be disciples. He wants to conform us to his image so that we reflect him to a world that's in desperate need of him. but doesn't know him. This is Jesus' school of discipleship. Amen.